So it seems that Warhammer 40k has got 3 new datasheets, updated rule sets for the Tankbustas and Ratlings, and a brand new unit of some rather murderous orcs with big hammers called the Breaka Boyz. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about a small clutch of new datasheets, 2 for the orcs and 1 for the Ratlings, all 3 units having had some interesting changes. These datasheets are basically the ones that we were expecting for the Ratlings and Tankbustas, the 2 units that got some entirely new model kits in Brutal and Cunning, the recent Kill Team box set that sold out rather quickly, and with Games Workshop's usual patterns I'd probably expect individual releases of these guys somewhere around about 2 to 3 months from now. They were both quite well received as miniatures go, the Ratlings with all their different specialist poses, and a fair bit of character and individuality between the different options for these little sniper halflings. For the Tankbustas, their new kit was looking bigger, meaner and greener than before. Heavier armour, slightly bigger models, plus a lot of melee gear, and I was suspecting that there might be a chance they could do 2 different datasheets from them with a ranged versus a melee loadout, particularly when they called them Breaka Boyz in one of the previews. That does appear to be the case. It looks like there's 2 different datasheets for them now, one that likes to break tanks and monsters up close and personal in close combat, and one with a barrage of rockets. Let's take a look through each of their datasheets, including some damage calculations as to what they're capable of, and a few thoughts as to how strong they're looking in game at the moment. First up, let's start with a new unit to the game in the Breaka Boyz, basically aimed to be the orc version of Tankbustas that like to smash tanks to bits up close and personal. It does seem that basically the range and the melee options are divided, so that could be a little bit unhelpful if you wanted, say, some rockets and some hammers for Kill Team. You can't currently field them as one mixed unit in Warhammer 40k, but given the variations in gear, you might be able to stretch some standard boys, so you could potentially get one kit and have the weapons to fill both units. In any case, the Breaka Boyz are 140 points per 6 of them, so as standard on-foot orcs go, they are really quite expensive. You can only take 6 models in their squad, so you can't double them up to squads of 12, and it means they're essentially 26 points per model, which means they're a bit more expensive than knobs, which are 21. For their durability, they are at least fairly resilient with all that armour plating, toughness 5 with a 4+ save and 2 wounds, basically the knob stat line for orcs, but as well as being more expensive per model, they don't have the -1 to wound protection that the knob squad gets, and as a result for the units they are going to be incredibly fragile once they're exposed, both small arms, things like heavy bolters and anti-tank weapons all being pretty efficient at shooting them. Basically, to be good, they do need to do quite a lot of damage, but it does seem that they're capable of that. Otherwise, for their unit things, they're OC1, Leadership 7, and have the Grenades keyword if you want that. And they've got really quite good character attachment. If any characters can lead a boys squad, then they can lead Breaka Boyz, so you could have a War Boss for the +1 to hit, or a mech for Dread Mob. The main focus of these boys is definitely the melee, but they do have a little bit of ranged threat. The main one are their bomb squig attacks. These work in the normal way, which when you've entered a normal move, you get to roll a 2+, and one unit within 12 inches takes D3 mortal wounds. And you get to do that twice per battle, but you can't trigger them both at once. Kind of handy for a little bit of scattergun damage, and you can use this to hit things that you can't see as well, which could be handy enough. You probably just would want to make sure that the bomb squig isn't going to make your charge significantly harder. Otherwise, the boss knob gets a rocket pistol, a single shot at strength 9 AP2 damage 3 on Orky Ballistic skill. He could take a second rocket pistol if he wanted to, but he definitely shouldn't do that given that then he'd have to replace his smash hammer. Talking of which, the base loadout for the squad is the smash hammer. These get 2 attacks each at strength 6, AP-2, damage 3, hitting on 3s, and they get the anti-monster and anti-vehicle keyword, and that makes them just really quite good general purpose weapons. That kind of profile is going to be really quite relevant against anything that's Space Marine size or bigger. Perhaps the biggest weakness will be that they have a low volume of attacks. Just 2 attacks apiece means they're not going to do all that much against hordes, though it does mean that they get more out of the war than the average orc squad, as it basically gives them a plus 50% damage boost. Jumping up from 2 attacks to 3 is a really big deal when applied to a whole squad. A special rule maybe isn't the most interesting one in the world. It allows you to re-roll the charge roll. Definitely doesn't hurt and might save you a command point re-roll from time to time, and just in general make their charging a bit more reliable and longer range. For their damage output, this is what you might expect if you charge in with 6 of them with smash hammers for 140 points. You'd expect around about 7 dead termagants, 3 or 4 slain intercessors, around about 3 slain terminators, 8 wounds to a 3+ save vehicle, or about 6 wounds to a Land Raider or another 2+ save vehicle. For 140 points worth of fairly fragile orcs getting into melee, that's not really the most impressive in terms of numbers, but orcs can really access quite a lot of nasty damage boosts. As mentioned, the war is kind of immense for them. That gets them plus 50% damage and 18 attacks rather than 12. In the Warhorde, they'll get sustained hits on 6s, and you could go for critical hits on 5s if you want that too. and if we're comparing to say a Nob squad, they'd probably be led by a War Boss for a +1 to hit. Putting those numbers in, and for a maximal damage squad, for a War Horde squad led by a War Boss in the war and using that critical hit 5 stratagem, on average the squad will one round a Land Raider with 16 wounds, do around about 21 wounds to anything with a 3+ save like a Gladiator or a Knight, or kill around about 7 Terminators on average if they didn't have some sort of other protection. And in reality that's not even the end of the story as well, as that's not including whatever the boss does. And Orc war bosses in the war can fight incredibly hard, getting their big attack bonus, never mind all the sustained hits and everything. It means that they should be able to one round really quite a massive amount of targets in the game. It seems they do compare kind of favourably to the Nob squad as well. Against anything Terminator size or bigger they seem to do better. The only real target that they're actually worse against are the Intercessors. Even against the Horde models, it seems like the Breaka Boyz special weapons can have them catch up a little bit. Overall, between all that and particularly with damage synergies that you can have, they do look adequately scary. Then though, you get the option to replace 2 Smash Hammers in the unit with a pair of special weapons. One can have the excellently named Knucklebusters and one can have a Tank Hammer. The Knucklebusters are really quite an interesting general purpose profile. 5 attacks at strength 5, AP 1, damage 1, but getting anti-monster and anti-vehicle 4+, and also twin linked. And between those two rules, they're basically going to be wounding most things in the game pretty much most of the time. Even if the AP and damage isn't huge, the Tank Hammer on the other hand is pretty much a direct upgrade but gains the hazardous keyword. It simply gets devastating wounds along with its anti-keywords, so basically means that every time you wound a monster or vehicle on a 4+, that will be straight through their armour, and the damage dished out as mortal wounds, and that'll still work on 6s against enemy infantry like Terminators. I thought it'd be interesting to take a look as to whether or not those special weapons are worth having or not. It seems that by my numbers they both are. Just for sake of comparison, I've looked at if you could arm 6 of them with Knucklebusters and then 6 with Tank Hammers. It looks like for the Knucklebusters, they're pretty much the same against Gladiators and Land Raiders. They lose a tiny bit of damage, but not so much that it's meaningful. They're a bit better against Intercessors, but just significantly better against Hordes. And I feel like it rounds out the squad a little bit, so they're not just going to get completely targeted by 1 wound infantry. The only thing that they're majorly behind against are against Terminators, where Smash Hammers are just a much better profile to deal with them. For the Tank Hammer though, as mentioned, it's basically a direct upgrade, so you might as well have it. I feel like the hazardous keyword is easily worth the risk. Knowing that vehicles aren't going to be able to take armor saves or invulnerable saves basically means that you get double damage against a 2+ save, so I'd say everyone's favourite rocket on a stick Tank Hammer is easily worth including. Overall, it does look like they do their job well. At base loadout, particularly when they've fired off a bomb squig, they're still going to be fairly scary against the vast majority of vehicles out there. They'll get far better in War Horde or if you give them a boss to lead them. By the numbers, they seem to be a pretty good competitor for regular Nobs. Basically, the Nobs have more durability due to having the same defensive profile but costing less and that big -1 to wound, where the Breaka Boyz are really quite easy to kill for the points. But overall, they seem to get better damage, particularly against 3 wound infantry and monsters and vehicles. Certainly feels like you could just throw a unit of 6 of these in with a war boss, take those special weapons and have a truck run them into the midfield, and then just use them as an incredibly scary deterrent to things like Terminators or vehicles advancing into the midboard, where if you buff them to the max in the turn of the war, they could easily be taking out something like a Chaos Knight in a single round of combat. Feels like they maybe could be interesting in Dread Mob as well. You could get the mech keyword with a big mech in the unit, and perhaps could be an interesting option for the critical wounds get AP2 better, given that with those anti-keywords, everything against vehicles is usually going to be a critical wound. Overall, I think it is pretty cool to see a very dedicated Orc melee anti-tank unit. I think perhaps the biggest challenge though is going to make sure that they trade up against something, kill something that's equal or higher value before being wiped out, as they're just going to fall over to return fire so much easier than a bunch of other things out there in the Orc list. Next though, let's move on to the regular guys with the rockets in the Tankbustas. There are 120 points per 6 of them, an increase on the previous squad which was 90 points per 5, but came with that annoying set gear with one of them having to take the twin rocket pistols and one of them having to take the Tank Hammer, which made them struggle to be all that good as a dedicated shooting unit. Like the Breaka Boyz, they do also get the 2 wounds, toughness 5 and 4+ save stats, and I guess these guys are effectively 20 points per model, so not quite as crazily fragile per point as the Breaka Boyz, but still go down to certain firepower that heavy bolters incredibly easily. For these guys, it looks like characters can attach to them as if they were looters, and that's quite interesting given that the old Tankbustas had far more restrictions. It means they can be joined by characters like the big mech with shock attack gun, which seems like the most obvious choice, as he's got a similar sort of damage profile, plus can give them reroll 1s to hit and gives them the mech keyword for Dread Mob. They don't really do too much in melee, though they still get a few volume attacks because they're orcs, Their regular close combat weapons even still strike at strength 5. The boss knob again gets the choice of either a chopper or a smash hammer, or you can swap either of those out for a pair of rocket pistols, which feels a bit more tempting in this one if you're trying to go max ranged things. Then maybe just having the one smash hammer in the squad could be worse if the squad does wind up finding itself in melee. Their main focus is definitely their range damage though. Their rocket launcher profiles are the same as before, D3 shots at strength 9, AP2, damage 3, all at 24 inches and with the blast keyword, so that means that they're a bit more efficient than they might otherwise be against elite infantry. Basically 5 of those guys get that, the knob gets his rocket pistols, and then one boy gets his choice of 2 things as a fun upgrade, both of which could be handy. Before mentioning those though, first up we've got their special rule. Looks like they've kept their previous one with a +1 to hit and wound monster or vehicle units, so that means that all those rocket shots will be hitting on a 4+ and wounding on a 4+ most of the time. And again, they're still able to double down with a few bomb squigs for mortal wounds if they happen to have an enemy within 12 inches. It does seem they get a bit more dangerous within 12 if you can deliver them that close, with 2 extra rocket pistol shots and some mortal wounds. If they're not able to get in quite that close though, their damage output at 18 to 24 inch range is maybe a little bit on the tame side. Out of cover, these are the rough sort of damage numbers that they put out. 5 rocket launchers kill around about 2 Terminators, around about 5 wounds to Gladiators or 4 wounds to Land Raiders, obviously dispensed in multiples of 3. And potentially if their targets get covered, that could reduce their damage output a bit, as it can be quite impactful on AP2. Despite being Tankbustas though, they're still plenty effective into 3 wound infantry, mainly because of having multiple copies of the blast keyword. As mentioned though, in reality their damage output's a little bit better than that, as they get one upgraded Tankbuster in the squad, and he either gets the choice to choose between taking an additional rocket launcher, so he gets 2, or taking a pulsar rocket. The additional rocket launcher is definitely nice, just more of the same, and that brings you back to 6 rocket launchers in a unit of 6, which is handy. The pulsar rocket is an interesting one though. If you take that, then instead of the additional rocket launcher, instead you get a once per game buff where their rockets go up to strength 10 for the entire squad and AP3 for the entire squad. So essentially the big barrage that they put out will be strength 10, AP3, damage 3 with +1 to hit and wound. Comparing the two, here are the rough numbers that those spit out. 6 rockets in the second line, and then the single round of 5 rockets with the pulsar rocket at the bottom. I feel like perhaps the biggest advantage of the pulsar rocket version is whenever they can target something that's toughness 9 or toughness 10, where you both get the +1 to wound and also better AP. It wins out really quite significantly against the gladiator tank target. Again, you could have bomb squigs and pistols in addition to those numbers, and I guess if the targets all had cover, it might skew things a bit more in the favour of the pulsar rocket one with the extra AP. Overall, for those kind of numbers, I feel like their damage output isn't awful, but it seems likely to fall short of killing most enemies in the game. Maybe a bit more likely to take a chunk out of tanks and vehicles as opposed to actually one round them, and perhaps only having a good chance to take out a normal sized tank if they happen to be within 12-inch range. In general, I'm not really sure it's the most impressive if it's unbuffed, particularly given that cover can reduce all those numbers quite a lot. And then at least compared with a bunch of other orcs, they're going to be a fair bit easier to kill for their points cost than most. I feel like if Tankbusters are going to work though, then maybe the Dread Mob might be the one to go for. Unless maybe we get some sort of Bad Moon shooting style detachment for the Grotmus ones, which I think would be rather cool. In Dread Mob, with a shock attack gun mech joining the unit, that's to have the squad cost 185 points. The shock attack gun mech gives you reroll ones to hit, which improves the damage output. The mech's big shock attack gun will get +1 to hit and wounds against tanks, which is really quite nice. That one's strength 9, AP4 and damage D6, plus gets an average of 4 or 5 shots per turn, so he's going to massively increase the squad's damage output. And then in the Dread Mob on top of that, both sustained hits 1 and lethal hits usually adds an extra 33% damage, presuming they're targeting something like a vehicle that's toughness 10 or higher. One squad could also take the Git Finder goggles as well for ignores cover too. And between all that, I feel like you've got really quite a fearsome anti-tank unit all of a sudden, and could be a different option versus big mobs of looters that maybe people tend to use there a bit more. A squad that's far more comfortable just taking out really big stuff as opposed to chipping away at them. They don't really use the bigger shells for bigger Git stratagem quite as handily though. They could get +1 damage for that, but they already get the +1 to wound. Overall, I feel like they're kind of merely okay outside of Dread Mob. With Dread Mob and a mech though, they feel like there could be some seriously savage shooting into enemy tanks and vehicles. Finally, for the third datasheet of the 3, we've got the Ratlings snipers. Presumably this will be the new datasheet that's quite similar to the one that's in the Imperial Guard Codex when it comes out. These guys are now available to buy in box sets of 10 now, but you can still take them as units of 5. They cost 60 points for 5 guys, or 120 points for units of 10. It does seem though that the way that they've gone with these is that the new fun gear that they can take is all locked to the 10-man squad, and that maybe is a bit of a disadvantage for them, given that often cheap infiltrator units like these guys often tend to get fielded as squad sizes of 5. For their base unit, they're pretty much exactly the same as they were for the Astra Militarum Codex. Toughness 2 and 1 wound each with a 6+ save, so incredibly fragile even with their stealth keywords. They don't have the regiment keyword, so no lethal hits from born soldiers. Though I feel even with the 60 points, the infiltrate keyword is at least kind of interesting to the guard, given that they don't actually have that many units that can infiltrate. You could maybe have a cheap squad of these hold up in a mid-board ruin to deny your opponent the opportunity to put down infiltrators, or maybe screen out scout moves, even if that toughness 2 profile really doesn't want to be anywhere near the front lines. For their damage output, they still get their sniper rifles at strength 4, AP 2 and damage 2. They have the heavy and the precision keywords on them, though I feel like they're kind of unlikely to be able to use the heavy keywords, as if they're exposed to enemy shooting, then just a few small flurries of small arms is going to wipe out the unit. Ideally they want to be moving into line of sight and then hiding with their shoot sharp and scarper special rule, which basically means that you can move, shoot, move, and it can mean that they can pop out of terrain, fire off some shots and then hide again, or potentially even just basically get essentially a 12-inch move out of the unit if they really want to get somewhere from A to B pretty fast, either say move blocking something or getting to an objective area. Their damage output for actually sniping characters is a bit limited though. Against a toughness 4 character with a 3+ save, 5 of them on average does 2 wounds to that, more or less. I guess there's a small chance that you might be able to snipe a 4 wound character, though it's not usually going to happen with one squad and one round of shooting, and gets a bit worse if the characters have got either higher toughness, higher saves, other defences, or 4+ invulnerable. They're just perhaps not quite at the point where they're going to be a massive threat, but might at least be able to plink a model or 2 from infantry as they go about doing a bit of board control anyway. Finally though, if you upgrade to the big unit of a 10-man squad, then you do get 3 upgrades for that. It doesn't seem like the worst way of doing it on paper, given that you might not otherwise normally use the big unit, as it often just tends to be far more efficient to field small squads like this as smaller units. Though I feel like this could be one of the squads that Games Workshop could afford to give a cheaper cost for the bigger unit to outweigh the loss in utility. In any case though, for the upgrades they get, they have a tank stopper rifle, a single shot at strength 9, AP 3 and damage D6, pretty much a Space Marine las fusel there. One shot of anything isn't going to be super reliable, but might be able to fry a heavy infantry model from time to time. The squad gets the grenades keyword, so that's one more option, though quite a lot of guard units do have that. And in this version they get their Battle Mutt Pug Dog, whose ammo supplies give them 1 round worth of lethal hits. That could keep them just a little bit more relevant against say toughness 5 characters, and just for the big 120 point squad with 9 snipers and lethal hits, presumably on the move if they want to move, shoot, hide. The mean damage would be 4.5 wounds to a toughness 3 character with a 4+ invulnerable save, or around about 4 to a toughness 4 one. It does maybe tip the balance just a little bit in that they would actually be a threat to characters now, presuming the entire squad could get a line of sight of course and stay safe to actually deal the damage, and there are actually characters in the enemy army that fit that kind of bill. Overall I feel like they're the sort of unit where if you want to take a unit of them, they're probably not going to hold back the army too much and could actually be genuinely quite good in certain matchups, though for the majority of time I don't really see them as being enormously competitive. They weren't really used so much for utility units in the 5-man squad, though very occasional lists did decide to take a unit. I don't really think that the 10-man unit is going to really change that. I think with such a big expensive squad you wouldn't really want them in the mid-board, where just any old unit of light troops charging into them could absolutely ruin them. So they'd be kind of relegated to a fire support unit, maybe hopping in and out of a ruin in your own deployment zone, hoping they can get lines of sight, and only really being good against the matchups where you actually know that you'll have good characters to target with them. And even then your opponent might have some good counterplay to that, being able to hide them at the bottom of ruins and things, or just put them in a position of the board where the Ratlings can't see them so easily. Overall I just feel like both sides of the squad could probably do with being a bit cheaper. 60 points and 120 just seems to be a bit too much for what they do right now in my opinion. In any case though, let me know your thoughts as to the new 40k datasheets. Look forward to hearing all your takes down in the comments below. Would you be tempted to put Breaka Boyz, new Tankbustas or Ratlings on the table? Looking forward to hearing all your thoughts and feedback. If you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.